Hey everyone, Rob B here with Rob D, and you are listening to the Property Podcast. This week, we're moving into dangerous territory. We're going to be discussing politics and looking at should you be fearful of a potential Labour government.
Welcome to the Property Podcast. Thank you for joining us. In case you don't know, we run a business that buys over £100 million worth of property for our clients each year. You can find out about that at propertyhub.net/invest. But today, yes, of course, Rishi caught us on a hop. We weren't expecting to be here talking about an election in June, but we are, and we've got thoughts.
It's time for our news stories of the week, and we will have a bumper episode next week when we bring you our market update for June. Lots to cover there. But let's keep you up to date with what's happening now. And house prices are up again. And we have the figures out from Nationwide. And prices are up month on month for the month of May by 0.4%. A reminder of what happened in April. It fell by 0.4%. So we've evened out the last 2 months. What's interesting now is house prices are up overall. So we're about 1.2% up for the year so far. So we saw a rise in January, a rise in February, a slight fall in March, a slightly bigger fall in April, and then May cancelling out April's numbers. So up by 1.2%. But that's only for 5 months of the year. And that is already better than what most people had predicted would happen this year. Of course, we've got a lot of year left and a lot could change. But that's fairly solid numbers. And as we talked about on the podcast before, sensible and solid growth is what we're all about. The market's not manic, but it's stable. And you can do good deals in this environment. So long may this slow, steady, and slightly boring growth continue.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's all lining up a bit more again now, because we had those weird couple of months where sentiment, everything, all the indicators we were seeing were improving, and yet prices, according to Nationwide, were falling. It's all pretty marginal, isn't it? But at least now everything is aligned. Also, news this week on the number of short-term lets in the UK. This is from a House of Commons report that's comparing the number of holiday lets now compared to 5 years ago, 2019. And the numbers are up significantly in almost every part of the UK. And when I say significantly, I'm talking about 50% plus increases in places like the Northwest, the East of England, and Yorkshire, 72% in the West Midlands. The only part of the country where the number of holiday lets has fallen is Scotland, because they've been strictly clamping down on holiday lets over recent years. Of course, it's exactly this increase which has brought about the government's plans to also restrict holiday lets in England. But will the sudden general election mean a reprieve for holiday let owners? We'll get into that a little bit later on.
We will, Rob, but let's get into the episode where we'll probably lose a good chunk of our listeners because people get very, very worked up about politics. And we have stupidly decided to talk about it at length today. But it's important because we may have a new government. I say may because nothing's guaranteed, but it seems, according to the bookies at least, that we are on for a Labour win. But before we get into the impact of a future Labour government or a future Conservative government, and we compare some of the policies and look what might happen, let's quickly talk about what's happened as a result of the election being called. Because it has had ramifications for property investors, just the election being called.
Yeah, the timing of it in particular, very, very significant. Significant for me because I was on holiday and having all this happen while I was trying to write stuff that wasn't going to age in a week was not good. But even more significant for property investors because it meant that the big property-related bills that were going through Parliament suddenly only had a few days to either make it or not make it. One of them did make it through, and we'll come to that. But you've got to start with the big one that didn't, which is the Renters Reform Bill. That bill that was supposed to end no-fault evictions, as well as so many other things, which we talked about so much on the podcast and the YouTube channel, just suddenly fizzled out. So, of course, that's not the end of the matter. The next government, whoever it is, will pick it up in some form. But as of right now, Rob, rental reform is no more.
No more for now, as you rightly point out. Angela Rayner has previously said that the Labour Party will deliver it within 100 days. And I'm fairly confident Conservatives will see it through as well if they manage to turn things around and win. So it's a temporary pause rather than being dead. But will it change significantly? Will it change a little bit? Or will it keep it the same? Once we know, we will let you know. And we're going to talk more about leaseholds on the podcast in a few weeks' time. But it's important for everyone to know that the leasehold bill did make it through. And that is significant. Now you may be thinking, well, there is no ground rent currently anyway. And that is correct. But this was looking at historic leases where ground rent still is in play. Not a surprise that this happened because some of the wealthiest and most influential people in the country have leaseholds galore, and a lot of their wealth is tied up in leaseholds. So if it was suddenly eradicated ground rent for those historic leases or capped, it would mean their wealth would be cut dramatically in an instant. The Duke of Westminster is famous for holding a significant number of those leaseholds, and he is a very wealthy person. In fact, probably top 10 in the country. So I think it's easy for us to fall into cynical mode here and go, powerful rich people didn't want this to happen. It didn't happen. Was that down to chance, or was it more meaningful? We'll let you decide.
Yeah, there's a chance it would have got there in the end if they'd had longer to debate it. But there's been a lot of talk about this for years and it's never gone anywhere, which is probably, Rob, because they're running up against the kind of barriers that you're talking about. But there are some important things in the leasehold bill. It means that if you do a lease extension now, whether it's for a house or a flat, you'll be able to extend by 990 years, which is not too bad. It does away with something called marriage value, which basically makes short leases more expensive to extend. If you're aware of the 80-year cutoff, that's what that's all about, but that's not going to be a thing anymore. And there are various things in there about requirements for service charges to be more transparent, more information to be provided, and it's going to stop freeholders and their management companies from charging huge commissions on arranging insurance, which they do now. So all positive changes. We haven't seen all the detail on this yet. We don't know quite when it's going to take effect. But because the bill made it through, it means it is definitely going to happen. So that's the immediate consequences of the election being called for the 4th of July. And of course, the big question is, well, what's going to happen after the 4th of July based on who wins? But we can't ignore the fact that we've got, or give or take, a month before then. So what's going to happen in the run-up to that election? I think the first thing that we can say almost for certain is that there is not going to be a cut to the base rate now. So we didn't know that there was going to be anyway, but the odds were looking reasonable that because inflation has been coming down, the Bank of England would decide to make their first cut to the base rate in June. But now an election's been called, they're basically just not going to do it because making a change at this point may look political and they don't want to look political. So I don't think it's going to make a big difference to the pricing you see on fixed rate mortgages for the next couple of months. But the base rate will almost certainly be staying where it is until August, which is the first time the Bank of England meet after the election.
This is one of the few things that surprised me about the timing of the election being called. Because as you said, Rob, the direction of travel was looking like in June we were going to have a cut. And that would have been great news for the Conservatives to have that cut in interest rates and say, right, now we're having an election, and then being able to say to everybody, look, we are in a much better place now. Interest rates are coming down. For the sake of a few weeks, they obviously have their reasons. They still don't seem to be clear what those reasons are, but they obviously have those reasons for calling it when they did. Having a base rate cut and then starting campaigning certainly would have made things easier. So it seems a bit bizarre to me, that one.
It's super weird. I don't really understand the timing of the election at all, because you certainly say that things for the party at the moment aren't going particularly great, and the economy isn't going that great, but it's improving. So more time that passes allows more time for good things to happen, which they can take credit for. But doing it now, I just don't see the advantage. But taking a self-interested view, Rob, I think it's good news that it's been announced so quickly, that there's such a short run-up to it, relatively speaking. We've only got a month to go, which is great because we don't have to get bombarded with politics for as long. And it's also good for the housing market because things tend to go a bit quiet in the run-up to elections while people wait to see what happens. So the fact that we've only got a month of that, for me, is good news.
Yeah, just for the news cycle, it's good news. So, will Labour destroy the property market? Rob, let's talk about what the Labour Party plan to do. And we'll talk a little bit about the Conservatives as well as we go. But as Labour are the favourites right now, let's focus on them. And as we've already said, Angela Rayner has said that the rental reform bill will be delivered in 100 days. Whether it's 100 days or not, I think it's fairly safe to say that if Labour come in, it's a shoo-in that the rental reform bill will come in as well. Do you want to put your neck on the line and say, do you think it'll change much if Labour deliver it?
Well, yeah, I am. And I think a lot of people will disagree with me on this, but I don't think it's going to be that different. So to be clear, whoever comes in, they're going to have to start again. They can't just pick up the bill where it was and carry on. They have to go back to the beginning with a new piece of legislation. But they can, of course, do a massive cut and paste and come back with something that looks basically the same. You'd certainly bet that a Labour version would look somewhat more tenant-friendly. If you look at the amendments that they tried to make to the previous bill, it's mostly around things like notice periods, such as needing to give more notice if you're selling a property or moving in compared to the previous version. And there were some people making more dramatic proposals and talking about having to compensate tenants if you ask them to leave and all kinds of stuff. I just don't think anything that crazy is going to be in there because, of course, it's good politically to talk tough about all this stuff. But Ultimately, whether you like it or not, and a lot of people don't, you do need the private rented sector to continue to exist and continue to function for now, even if you don't want it to long term. So I don't think it's going to come back looking that different. Like I say, Rob, a lot of people will disagree with me. A lot of landlords are terrified of the prospect of a Labour government. And maybe you disagree with me. Maybe I'm just living in my own utopia over here.
No, my opinion, unfortunately, for the entertainment factor of the podcast is very similar to yours. I think it may be slightly different, but I don't think a lot different. And because it's not much different, it's not particularly much worse than what was going to be delivered originally. And even if it was delivered, Labour still could have come in and made the tweaks and changes at some point in the future anyway. So although the Renters Reform Bill isn't particularly popular with a lot of landlords, both parties want to introduce it, and Labour's version won't be that much different to the Conservatives' version. The one that is worrying, Rob, for me, if it happens, it's a big if, is rent controls. So I think it's important to say that Conservatives have said no rent controls and they're against rent freezes. So that's cut and dry, that's done. Labour had previously been saying no rent controls. Their Shadow Chancellor was saying no rent controls. But there have been a few contradictory comments from some of the other members of the Labour Party suggesting that there's a chance it may happen. What's the reality? What's the truth here?
I don't know. I think there is a chance that they could give local powers to do some kind of rent control. I wouldn't completely rule it out, but I'd still put it on the unlikely pile, at least initially, because rental growth has come right down anyway. And while rents are always going to go up, because everything always goes up, we just don't have the double-digit increases that we did about a year ago. Give it another 6 months, some of the past data will have dropped out, and the year-on-year increase won't look that scary. So there'll be less of a, oh my God, but something must be done feel about the whole thing. So there's some people like the London Mayor who've been asking for rent controls for a long time. Maybe it's something that could happen at some point, but again, maybe I'm just being optimistic, but I don't see it happening to start with.
No, neither do I. And the reason why is twofold. First of all, we've got Scotland as an example of how terrible it is. It just doesn't work as a system. Rents are set by supply and demand. It's pretty much as simple as that. And if you suddenly restrict supply because landlords don't want to move into a market, then yes, you may have rents controlled for existing tenants, but for everyone else coming in afterwards, they're going to be sky high. So as a system, I think it's flawed. I think the intention is fair enough. I get it. It's not something that particularly would suit me and my financial situation, but I get it as a concept. But to deliver the concept, it's currently flawed. And the second reason I have confidence is the fact that the Chancellor has said that it's not going to happen. So obviously I can't make any promises, and I'm not endorsing Labour here for everyone listening to say, don't worry, it's going to be fine, everyone. But as the Labour government are currently favourites to come in, how do I feel about it? I feel mostly okay. I'd prefer that some of the party hadn't said what they said about localised rent controls. But the fact that the powers at the top, the ones with the most power, have said it's not happening, gives me some confidence.
So if we look at other things an incoming Labour government might do, they may pick up leasehold reform and keep going with that. The existing bill will go through, but it doesn't have that cap on previous ground rents, which they may come in and try to make happen. And they've spoken in the recent past about getting rid of leasehold altogether and replacing it with something called common hold, which already exists in law. It just never gets used, basically. And this is ultimately the direction that the Conservative government were going in. Michael Gove spoke about wanting to get rid of leasehold at various points and then basically wasn't getting far with it. They had to pivot to capping ground rents instead, and then in the end didn't even manage to make that happen. But they may get there. I think it will ultimately come down to priorities and political will to get past some of the people who don't want that to happen. Another thing that I think they probably will do at some point, is just a case of when, is push ahead with the reforms to holiday lets that we've spoken about recently. Because just within the last couple of months, the Conservatives announced that they were going to create a national licensing scheme and effectively give local authorities the ability to deny permission for new holiday lets to control their numbers. They said that that's what they were going to do, but in the end, they didn't have time to actually pass the law. So that was supposed to take effect from this summer. My guess is that that will now be delayed. Again, I think it's going to happen at some point, because as we're kind of discovering as we talk about this, there hasn't been much difference between the two parties when it comes to housing. They're both talking about wanting to do the same things. It's just going to be a matter of priorities about what happens and when. So I think we may have a delay to some of that stuff around holiday lets, but again, will happen at some point.
Now, there's a lot to cover when you look at all the policies, and we have gone through some of the big ones. We will get into some more of the detail in the market update next week, but one that caught my eye, Rob, that I think we need to share for this episode is the housing supply targets. the housing supply targets that we've been commenting on since pretty much the introduction of the podcast, so over 10 years now. And would you like to hazard a guess of each year we've been given a target by the government? How many times have we hit the housing target since we started recording the podcast over 10 years ago?
I'm going to be generous and say once, because surely they can't miss it every year. After you missed it for a while, just reduce the target so you hit it. Like, they must have hit it at least once, right?
That would make sense, wouldn't it? But no, never hit it.
All right.
So it amuses me that the Conservatives and Labour Party have, again, the same number, and they're both going for 300,000 new homes each and every year. Last year, we had a pretty good year. We didn't hit the 300,000 target, but we hit just over 200. So 60-odd% of target isn't too bad, but it's still way off. And we seem to have these fantasy targets that are given to us each and every year. The population is increasing, so you do need homes, but you need them in the right areas as well. So just saying that you want 300,000 new homes, I suppose the sentiment is in the right direction. You do need new homes, but it's where they're needed is important. And there never seems to be that detail there. Maybe they don't care. Maybe if they hit the headline number, they can say they've delivered it. That might be the case. We don't get that level of detail, as I've said, but we are still way short and are consistently way short each and every year. But as I said, Rob, the numbers are the same from both parties. And as you touched on a moment ago, a lot of these policies are similar. And as the policies are so similar, it really doesn't matter who wins. And that's around housing, right? People will be much more passionate around other things. But around housing and property investment, yes, there are differences, but not for me anything significant enough for me to go, oh, well, I really must vote one way or another based on the policies on housing alone. The only one that makes me a tad nervous, as I've touched on already, is the rent controls. But as I've stated, I think that's highly unlikely, certainly nationally anyway. And you've said the same, Rob. So based on that, I don't think people should be making their votes based on their property investment interests, because Labour and the Conservatives have been coming to a closer place for a long time. People have said that the Conservatives have been moving into Labour's territory in terms of policies for years now. That's up to you to decide when you're listening. But if that's the case, red or blue, whichever we end up in, for property investment at least, there isn't going to be a lot of change. But actually, Rob, I think that's really good because we can plan. Because there's nothing dramatic here, because there's nothing overly scary that we think will actually be delivered, we can just plan for the long term as we normally do, and we'll be all right. Property investment over the long term, will we be talking about this election in 10 years and this impact it had on the property investment market? For me, that's a sure no. We will not even remember this election and its impact for property investment. And I think that's the main thing we actually need to take away from this.
That's right. If you look at what's happened over the last decade, and if you look at some of the changes that have negatively affected property investors, including all the tax changes and the stamp duty surcharge and all the legislation stuff, if you looked at those without knowing which party was in power, you wouldn't be able to guess. I think because historically, the Conservative Party has been more landlord-friendly, business-friendly. I don't know quite how to phrase it, but you know what I mean. I think people get the impression that a Labour government would be very different. But based on the last 10 years, I don't think so. I get that you can look at Wales, for example, which is under Labour control, and see some of the things that they've done. But all the rental reform stuff, which is being put through by the Conservatives, is pretty similar to all of that anyway. So I'm not trying to endorse any particular party here. I won't be voting for any of them, but I didn't vote for any of them last time either. But I'm just agreeing with you, Rob, that I think because we're going to have, thank mercifully, only a month of it, but we're going to have all this pushed as being such a pivotal election in so many different ways. I don't think it's going to be that pivotal in any particular way, but in terms of property in particular, I don't see it as being that significant. And like you say, Rob, knowing what to expect, no big change, that's a very good thing.
It is. And we got to the end of the pod without alienating too many people, I hope, because we've not been too partisan or partisan at all. But I'm going to give a little bit of juice at the end just to stir people up. And this is that, for me, this potentially future Labour government isn't that different to the Conservative government, which we said. And that suits them. That suits Labour, because Labour want to get into power. So if their marketing angle is, we'll be a bit better than Conservatives and fight less, but be similar, that's probably enough to win the election at the moment, because a lot of people are fed up with the Conservatives. When you look at previous Labour leaders, people may have looked at Conservatives and gone, I'm not particularly happy, but that bloke there is really scary and I don't want him running our country. That's what may have stopped them winning previously. By playing it safe, by being in the centre and just be a slightly different version of what's in power now, makes it easier for people to vote for them. That also means there's probably not going to be a lot of dramatic changes. Of course there will be changes, and hopefully for the better, if it happens. Whether you like them or not, if they win and they do go in power, you want them to do well because it suits everyone's interests. But it's not going to be dramatically different. Hopefully it is a bit better. But because it's not a dramatic election, don't get wound up by it. Just block it out, put your vote in, do whatever you want, but don't let it bother you mentally. It's not going to make a meaningful difference. Just like the last election, if you look at the time we've had since the last election, not a lot meaningful has happened. Nothing that we can talk about in 10, 20 years' time to say, oh, in the last 5 years, the government's delivered X, Y, Z, and it's made a big difference to all our lives. Yeah, there may have been some slightly good things and some slightly annoying things, but overall, nothing that's happened in the last 5 years from our current government is going to move the needle for the next 20. And it's always going to be the same for the next 5 years if it's a Labour government. So the point to take away from this is don't let this bother you. It's not a massive event in the history of the world. There are bigger things that have happened in our country alone that have made a bigger difference, and they've not really impacted the property market. Things like Brexit, COVID, which hit us worldwide and obviously made a big impact in this country. Again, there were changes to the property market, but in 20 years' time, will we be talking about the impact of COVID and how that looks on the property market? No. So if you invest for the short term, of course, these market moves can make a difference, if you're doing flips, for example. But if you're investing for the long term, you should just put your blinkers on, put your earmuffs on, and just block it out. Just get on with your life. Invest for the long term. You will be fine. You will be safe. It's not going to change that dramatically. These governments aren't extreme than what we're being offered. So as they're not extreme, the impact on your portfolio won't be extreme, and you'll be fine.
Okay, well, I'm sure we'll have more politics to talk about in next week's market update episode, as well as everything else that's been going on over the last month. But for this episode, let's just quickly wrap up with Hub Extra, the part of the show where we give you a resource to make your life a little bit better in some form. And Rob, you've got a tech tool for us this week.
I have. I've been playing around with a new browser. It's called Arc Browser. So if you go to arc.net, you can find it. And I've been really enjoying it. It's a different experience. It takes a little bit getting used to. But once you're used to it, I think it's a really good browser. I'm not using it exclusively, so I will say that. So it's not suddenly replaced everything else I use. But I do really like how it works. It's a different take on browsers that we currently use. The iPhone app I found really cool. But again, I do find myself using different browsers. So it's not got me completely, but I do really like it. It also uses AI, so it takes advantage of Perplexity and other AI providers. So it is a cool browser. I'm not saying dump everything and move your life onto Arc, but I think it's worth a little look and it's worth playing around with, and it's completely free.
I don't need too much encouragement to try out a new browser, so you got me with that one, Rob. I will be giving it a try later on. But for now, let's just finish with a quick shout out to listener Jordan, who got in touch saying, I've been following you guys for a while now and read many of your books that I still refer back to. And you've been the main cause for me kickstarting my property journey, 3 rentals so far. I'm planning to continue for many years. Thank you for turning my procrastination into doing. Well, Jordan, you are very welcome. But of course, it's all you. You did it. And getting up to 3 is already further than most other people ever get. So well done to you.
So that's us done for another week. Rob and I have survived an episode on politics of no fighting. Hopefully you don't want to fight with us after this episode, and you'll be more than happy to join us for next week's podcast, where we'll be giving you a market update. Before then, of course, we'll have Ask Rob and Rob, and you can also find us in the home section in the Sunday Times, answering your questions there as well. So until all these wonderful events occur, take care, have fun. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.